Alright, so as I mentioned, we're going to do our game talk today, and so we talked about the concepts and a little bit about how to make a game, all the higher level stuff last class. And so this class we're just going to dive down into those topics that I mentioned before and show you kind of how games are made in Unity. So I have Unity open here, and I already have a example project that I've downloaded, and we'll go through this in a second. But I just wanted to go over the Unity interface with you. So hopefully you have this open. If not, you can install it or open it later after class. But starting up in the top left-hand corner, we have these different controls. And so we have the hand control, we have this little arrow control, we have this little kind of cyclical control, we have this this control that looks like arrows are coming out of each corner, and then we have this little box with some dots on it. So let's just start with the hand control first. I can take that hand control and pan around my scene here by just clicking and dragging. If I click on this arrow tool and I click on a certain element, I can move that element up and down using the kind of little widgets handles here. And so what I've done here is this arrow will move it along the y-axis. Y-axis is up in this case, whereas the z-axis is to your right. And the way that I know that is these axes here are labeled y, z, and x. And so x is facing the camera right now, and you can see that that's red. And that's pretty standard. And actually, a little kind of small thing that I found out a little while ago is the X is always red, Y is always green, and Z is always blue. And that's RGB, so it's like the red, green, blue values. And so oftentimes you can represent coordinate systems in RGB values, but that's why they're RG and blue, or yeah, RG blue, RG and RGB. Excuse me. So anyway, that's what those little arrows mean, and you can move those along those paths. And if I scroll with my mouse wheel, I can zoom in, and if I drag, you can see there's a little tiny box. It actually doesn't get any bigger. I can actually make that bigger with this guy, but there's a red box, there's a green box that's on the bottom, and then there's a blue box. And what that does is that's a plane. I can move it along the plane, so if I grab this red box, I can move it up and down, but it doesn't come forward. It always stays in that one position. Whereas if I kind of tilt it up here and grab this green box, you can see that I'm moving it along that bottom plane. And so these are just ways of manipulating your objects once they're in the scene. The other option that we have up here is this little cyclical thing. This is for rotation. And again, I get this nice little widget, and green will rotate it around the y-axis. And so the y-axis is straight down, or up and down. And so it's going to rotate that around that axis. And so if I drag this green line, I can spin it this way. The blue is the z-axis, and again, the z-axis runs right and left in proportion to where my camera is right now. And so if I spin that, that's actually going to tumble this object backwards and forward. And then finally we have the red one, or the x-plane, which is somewhere around here. Here it is. And so that'll do on the x-plane. You can see that the x coordinate system is running kind of down and to the right, and so you can think about that as a spool, and this is the axle that comes through it, and then it's going to spin around that axis. All right, so those are our main tools. If you want to resize it, for example, we have the resize tool in this one, and then this one is for mostly GUI elements, so we can resize those GUI elements based on their outer dimensions. And so we have the scale tool again, we have the rotation tool, and we have the move tool, and then the hand tool moves our camera. However, if you hold down the option key and click, you have an eye icon, and then you can kind of rotate this around whatever object you're currently looking around. And so the shortcuts for that hand is Option Command, and it might be different on Windows, but you can see I'm panning around now, and I'm looking around. So that's the basic navigation of Unity, how to move the camera around, and by camera I just mean the current viewport, because we do have a camera in our scene, which gets to our next option here. Is we have a third-person controller, and let's just ignore that for right now. That's just our player character. But most importantly, above him, we have our camera. And so the camera is underneath this object or nested within our character. His name is Ethan, by the way. And so Ethan has a camera that is always going to follow him. And so if I click on our hierarchy view here, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner we have our preview window. And that is going to always show Ethan in the bottom of that. And if I hit the play button, we can see exactly what that looks like. I've turned my interface red just so I know that I'm in play mode, because we'll get to this in a second, but if you edit any attributes as you're playing the game, they don't save. And so I make the interface red so that I know not to edit them, or if I do edit them, that I know they're not going to get saved. So I've done that in the preferences, so you might not see this if you hit the play button. If I hit forward, he walks forward, back. There's something weird with the camera, but I can pan around, and so no matter where my character moves to, the camera always moves. And so if I spin over here and I go back to my game tab, or my scene tab, right now we're in the game tab, go back over to the scene tab and zoom out and then pan down the hallway to where our character now is. You can see Ethan is looking down the hall this way and our camera's pointing this way. And so what I can actually do is switch between these. So this is my actual gameplay, and this is just kind of a scene view. I can rotate around. I could actually go in here. Let me zoom in. Let's see, turn this guy off. Trying to select the guy here. Okay, let me these are all probably baked in there. Anyway, what I was going to show is you can kind of manipulate those objects. Let's get to that in a second. What I did want to show you is that we can put these side by dragging that tab out just like a browser window. And now I can have these side by side. And of course my camera gets messed up for some reason with this particular level, and I'm not sure why. But let's just ignore that kind of weird effect over there. But as I move the character back and forth, you can see this is again my scene view that I'm free to move around in, and then this is actually my game view. So I'm walking around my game view. So with Ethan here, I can change all sorts of things on him. Not that, but let's say, for example, I wanted to move the floor. Let me pause this for a second. Oh, that's a static element. Okay, I can't move static elements. What can I move in this scene? That's also a static element. Okay, there's not very much I can move in this scene, because when you mark items as static, that tells the game engine, okay, this is never going to move, so don't try to move it. And that just takes care of physics and makes sure that the game engine doesn't make physics act upon it, so there's less calculation with it. That's just a checkbox up here in the right-hand corner. Let's see, where was that guy again? Yeah, so I'm not going to be able to move that right now, but what I was going to show you is you can move these objects in real life, and so maybe if you're testing out how far a jump platform is, you can jump your character and maybe put a safety net under or something like that, or move your character in the scene view, put him back on the first platform, have him jump and see how far he can jump, and then adjust that platform in this scene, and then play it in the same thing. So I'm going to just get out of this for right now. I'm going to take this game and slide it back over here so that we're not seeing two of those. So that's the hierarchy view, and you can see in this level we have a lot of different elements. We have a skeleton, and if we double click on that, it'll bring you to that object. So I can pan around there and see some bones on there. You know, here's a plank. If I double click on that, that's where the plank is, and I can move these now that I'm not playing the game anymore. They're static, but you can move these around after the fact. And you see that when I move this, it looks like these pieces of wood burnt something into the ground there, kind of like, I don't know, mold or mildew underneath that or something. What's actually happened in this scene is all the lights and shadows have been baked into the textures that are on the ground. And so when I move this, the physical texture or the image that is being displayed on this floor is altered with the shadow on there. And that way we don't have to calculate shadows in real time. And so if I place those back, it looks like they're shadows there, right? It looks like they're maybe computer generated. It's taken the light from over in the top left-hand corner by that torch, you know, somewhere over there. I guess it's a fireplace or something, and casting a shadow on here. But again, because it's baked in, there's actually a button that you hit that's called baking or it's the light baking button. And so you take that button, you press it, and then it does all these calculations, goes through all your scenes, and then physically alters all your textures to match the shadowing here. And so if we click over here, we can see that that also has some items in there that's burnt. So that's light baking, and that's how we kind of optimize some of these things in our game. Okay, so there's that window, and then maybe you looked at the bottom here, and we have this is our project view, and so this is what you might be used to when you're working in Android or something like that, where you have all your files, all your code files, all your assets, all your images, your XML files, etc. That lives, so to speak, down here under the assets folder. And so whatever I click on the left will show you what's in that folder on the right. And if we go down to meshes, you can see that here are all of our actual models. So by clicking on one of these, you can get a preview of this stone curve object. And if we, let's like click on this skull pile, you can see this guy. And this is not just an image, this is actually a 3D object that we can move around in space. So hopefully you can see that. If you right click on the bar here, you can get a full window preview here. And so now I can rotate that around, say, yep, that asset looks good. You can close the window here, returns that there, and then maybe drag that into my scene by simply just dragging it there. And then of course, to make it more optimal, I would just check static and say yes, make all the children static, because if we look under this object, and you can see I dragged it on my scene and it appears in my list here. If I disclose that, this skull actually has several different pieces in it. So it has skull 2, which I can physically move over here. Maybe I want to make a different orientation of it, drag that out, that sort of thing. I can do that. Or I can drag the plane and move it along this plane here, which is maybe a little bit more freedom. Gives you 2 axes of movement rather than just one by grabbing these arrows. So now I've just scattered some skulls across my level. I've made them all static so they won't move. So if the player walks over them, they won't, you know, roll. But if you wanted that effect, you can add some physics bodies to them, and when the character collides with them, they'll actually have some force acted upon them and roll maybe down the hallway. And then you can add sound to that effect, and having the skulls roll down the hallway would be actually pretty cool. But if we expand this skull object, you can see down here, let me expand this a little bit so you can actually see these objects. And our skull, where'd our skull go? Here. So you can notice that all these objects, all these meshes have arrows next to them. And if you click those arrows, it'll tell you all the sub-meshes that are under it. So we have a bunch of different skulls underneath that. And what these are 3D meshes, as I mentioned last class. These are geometry that define XY coordinates and how those connect. And if you right click on them and go to Reveal in Finder, if you're on Windows it's something similar, though I forget, you'll see that there's a whole list of what are called Fbx files. And if you look where I am, I'm in my dungeon level kit, assets, and then this is a folder I created called BSU game. But what we can do is I've already dragged in another, or I've imported, I should say, another object into Blender, and this is a skeleton, obviously, but this is the same exact file that I just showed you, just a different mesh. And so with Blender, we can go ahead and it's very similar to Unity, as we can rotate around, we can zoom in, we can pan our object. But if I select one of these objects, as you can see, it's composed of an arm, a couple arm bones, a hip bone, the ribs. If I hit tab in Blender, I can actually see the vertices that make up the rib cage, the hips, the spine, and I can manipulate these however I want. So if I, let's say, let's grab a bunch of his back vertices, and as I select these, you can see that they begin to highlight. And then maybe I want to move them out like this, kind of give them a little bit more of a broader back. And let's see, maybe I'll try to get fancy and do some randomization on these vertices. And so I just hit this randomize button. It takes all the vertices and just jumbles it up a little bit. And if I tab out of that, you can see now my mesh has seriously been altered. But that's kind of a cool effect, kind of like a a mutant or something like that. And what I can do is I can save that Fbx file, re-import that in, and now I've just changed my model. So I won't do that at the moment, but that's how you can manipulate stuff that already exists in Unity, or if you know enough about Blender and you want to create your own models and import them that way, Blender has a file export feature, and you can export this directly to Fbx, so whatever's in your scene. If you want to make a chest, if you want to make a book or a torch or a weapon, you model it first in an application like Blender. It doesn't have to be Blender exactly, but the key is to export it to Fbx. And Unity and Blender actually work really, really well, where you can drag in the Blender file into your assets folder, and Unity will do the export for you into XBF format. And the cool thing about that is when you update the Blender file by hitting save, it'll also update it in Unity as well. We don't have any Blender files in here, but
what's FBX stand for?
That is a good question. It's a particular application format. I want to say, I'm going to get this wrong if I say it, but I think it's like an AutoCAD file. It's just a very, very simple file. Yeah, it has animation data that goes along with it, and also
Film box.
What's that?
Film box.
Film box? Maybe. That doesn't ring a bell, but yeah, that's a good question. I know it's originally a native format for another application or standard that people just started using. As you can see, there's other ones like Collider, which is DAE. There's 3D Studio, which is 3DS. Wavefront's pretty popular, an OBJ file. So you often see those. And what you can do is you can go on, there's a lot of websites such as, let me open one up here. TurboSquid is a favorite amongst 3D enthusiasts, but if you want to go on and you want to say, find me a skeleton, just do a search and you can find all sorts of skeleton models. Some are really, really high resolution, like this one, and this one particular costs $99. Yeah, but if we, let's see, this one's $59. It's a good deal. But you can actually see kind of what it is, how detailed it is. So obviously this is a lot more detailed than our particular skeleton. And then some of these screenshots have wireframes, so you can actually see the vertices and edges that make up this particular model. So you can see this is a high polygon model, and you can confirm that by scrolling down, and you can see that the vertices, the number of points on this is 34,000. And you can see how many polygons it actually has. And so a low poly model is what we refer to when we talk about a low polygon count. Now, what defines a low polygon versus a high polygon model? It's kind of arbitrary depending upon what you're doing. I mean, one of those is like when you see it, but also it also highly depends on what you're using. So for example, this might actually be considered a low poly model if you were going to do maybe real close-up film animation or something like that, whereas in a game this is a high poly model because there's really no reason why we need to render all these vertices and polygons on the screen, because the CPU or the GPU, I guess in most cases, the effort that it takes just to rotate this around the screen or do whatever or animate it is probably a little bit too high for most systems, especially for mobile, which is kind of what we're talking about. So that's why I want to touch upon this a little bit, is just to give you an idea of, I probably wouldn't use this model. I would probably use something closer like this, because if we tab in here, you can see, yeah, it does have a lot of points in here, and I did mess up the model a little bit by randomizing it, and I can actually undo that. So you can see, for the most part, that looks pretty good. And if we go back into Unity, let's see if I can find that skeleton guy. Here's a skeleton. It's not the particular one, but you can see that it looks very similar to our skeleton model here. And so, I mean, it doesn't look terrible, and if you want to design games for higher end systems, then yeah, maybe you add a little bit more polygons to smooth out these rough edges, because basically if you click on this guy and zoom in, not too much, but there we go, you can see that each one of these points, these lines, each line connects to a vertices. So you can see that this one is a very low vertice. There's a vertice here, there's a vertice there, and so if you want to make that more round, maybe you put another vertice out there and then round off that edge. And so you can see how adding vertices will round your edges off. And in Blender, we can do the same thing here by adding a modifier. I have a limited view here in this particular screen. But what we can do is we actually subdivide all these edges using the subdivision surface modifier. So if I click on that, you can see instantly it kind of rounds that off. It didn't do a very good job, but you can get the idea that if I play with this a little bit, that I can get those ribs to be a little bit more round. And so if we dive into that and show it in the edit here, you can see that added a bunch more vertices, and we can turn that up. Let's see, yeah, that should be this one. Let's go ahead and apply that and see. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, so it didn't show you all the vertices in edit mode, but when I did apply that, you can see that I have added way too many vertices to that. So let's undo that real quick. Add that back in. I'm just going to add maybe 2. Hit apply. Edit there. And so you can see by dividing it twice, it did add a ton more vertices, but it also made it rounder. And so obviously this is not the best example, but you get the idea of how to round those off a little bit better. But again, you have to watch your polygon count. And so they make little plugins that you can watch your frames per second. And we mentioned the frames per second of how many times it's drawing the screen, and you can get that count. It's just a little. Actually, I do believe I have it in here, but I won't play with that right now. Okay, so that's our view. We can drag these meshes in wherever we want, and you can see that this one, if I move this, you can see it kind of has some shadowing underneath it. And again, that's our light baking. And when you add new models to your scene, you have to rebake your lights, and that often takes quite a while depending upon how big your scene is. So I won't do that at the moment. But you'd go over to, let's see, lighting, and is it in lighting? Yeah, it should be in lighting.
So
Light maps.
The baking process remove things from things you moved also.
Yes. Yeah, it would recalculate all the shadows and everything. So it would go back through your entire scene and check that. Yep. Okay, so we covered most of the interface, but the most important thing, and the thing you'll probably use the most, is this inspector on the right. And so I have, let's actually go to Ethan because he's a little bit more interesting. Let me make these a little bit more manageable. So we have a third-person controller. If I double-click on that, you can go to them. Or if you select something else in the scene and you want to hit the F key, that'll zoom out or zoom into them, depending upon where you are. And so here's our third-person character. Obviously, it's third-person because the camera is behind the character. We also have a first-person character controller, and that doesn't have a rendered mesh. And so if we zoom into Ethan, you can see that he's a little bit more high poly model. You can see it has a lot more vertices that make up his model. He is animated. We'll get to that in a little bit, but he also has this little capsule that surrounds him in green. This is the Capsule Collider. This enables us to have him collide with other objects. And so if I zoom out a little bit and I select this pillar here, you can see that this guy has a mesh collider on him. Again, mesh is referring to the geometry of the object. And so what this is doing is it's wherever there's geometry of this object, there's going to be a collider on it. But this is very, very expensive as compared to the Capsule Collider, because as you imagine with this archway here, we also have all these different vertices, and so on the collider we have to also make that collider match each one of those vertices. Whereas the Capsule Collider, even though Ethan has a very high polygon count, we don't have to match up every single collider point to every point on Ethan because we don't really care. We just kind of want him to run into things, but it doesn't really matter if his hand bumps into something, right? So you might see an instance where his hand, if he turns, will go through an object because you can see that it's sticking out of that Capsule Collider. But if I play this game and I rotate over to this pillar, you can see that he gets stuck. I can try to walk in, he just kind of sticks there. And if we go into our scene view, you can see that's this round edge of his collider is hitting this mesh collider, this green arrow, or this green, the green mesh on this object. And so that's how colliders work. To actually add your own, let's go ahead and go back to Ethan. And so by selecting Ethan, we can look at all of his attributes. And so right now he has an animator on him. And let me hit the play button because I can turn these off and on. So he has an animator. If I turn that animator off, you can see he stops swaying back and forth. If I click that again, he's back to swaying. He has a rigid body which allows him to act, basically have gravity. If he jumps up in the air, hitting the okay, this is his animator's turned off. Oops, hold on a second. Okay, select that, select the scene game view again. Okay, so as he jumps, you can see his hands come up and he falls back to earth. And this is because of the rigid body. Gravity is acting on him, so he has that rigid body component on his 3D model there. The Capsule Collider, so if I turn that off, oops, I fell through the floor. So if I turn that back on, it's too late because he's already falling through the floor. So this is really important to have colliders on your characters because not only are they colliding with objects like walls, but also the ground plane itself. And so this is really evident when, let me actually see if I can. You know, if you're playing your game and you're trying to test out a part of your level that's really, really far away, what you can do instead of having to walk over there every time you hit that play button is just drag your character over there. And because it's in the play mode, you can see that, well, maybe you can't see that, but if I drag Ethan up and let him go, then gravity acts on him. So I can manipulate objects while I'm playing. If you want to pause that, I can pause it, you know, lift him up. Maybe I'm testing the fact that if he falls too far, he dies, and so maybe I can lift that up a little bit. Hit the game scene. hit the pause button. Make sure you don't hit the play button because it'll stop it. And you can see that now I've moved my character all the way over here. I can go around, and what I was going to show you is because of those colliders, I can walk up the stairs. I can jump. I can, well, I don't know what the squat button is, but I can do that as well. And I can jump off the balcony here. I can jump on this table, I think. Oh, okay, I just went through the table. So maybe you discover a bug in your game. Say, okay, well that doesn't have a collider on it, so he does not like to back up very well. So I can pause this, go back to my scene, double click on Ethan, select this one, and make sure you're selecting the parent of this. And you can see that this object doesn't have any colliders on it, so I just go over here, and you can type in collider. You see, I've already done it from the last command. But we have several options here. So the box collider is probably the cheapest one to implement because it's just 6 points, or 8 points, excuse me, 8 points, 2 squares connected. So if I select that, you can see that it creates that, but it created a very small version of that, and so I can hit this edit collider, and then that gives me these face selectors that I can grab these faces and drag it up. Here's the back one, drag that out, and try to get the dimensions to be pretty close. I can move this around to the other side and drag this collider out. Now if I drag this collider too far out, and I'm testing this, and I hit the play button, go back, and wow, my camera's all messed up now. Okay, well, for some reason my camera's messed up, but if I go back to my scene view, actually let me split these again. Okay, that kind of helps a little bit. You can see I can't go through that anymore. But, as I said, if you're testing and you come over to this side and you're like, oh wow, I can't move, but there's nothing physically in front of me, so maybe you can move that collider a little bit closer. Go over to your game view and say, well, maybe that's a little bit too far, and so you can keep adjusting that collider just to get it, to look good in your game. And so the power of Unity is you can edit your game while you're playing it. However, I mentioned that this interface is red, so if I stop that and go back to my tomb, you can see that that collider is no longer on that. So any changes that you make while that button is in play mode will not persist when you stop the game. And so you can do a couple of things. You can try to copy that component out. You can copy the components by clicking on this gear and hitting copy component, and then when you hit the stop button, applying that to this back to the object. Now you can only do one of those at a time. I've done it where I had a whole bunch of XYZ coordinates written down, so I'd nudge things around, be like, okay, that's perfect, and then I'd have to copy those values out and and do it that way. So there are other ways to do that a little bit better, but just make sure, again, when you hit that play button, and again, that's why I've colored my user interface red. And if you want that same effect, just go to colors and play mode tint. You can change the play mode tint. So right now I'm obviously in the play mode. If I hit blue, you can make it blue, no big deal. But that's how you do it. So I really like to know that these controls are off limits when I'm editing my game, or if I again want to just mess around with it. Okay, I want to show you one more thing of the Unity editor. So I've, maybe I accidentally dragged this guy down here, and I drag this guy up here, and I'm like, oh man, my interface is all messed up. How do I reset it back to what the default was? You can go up to Window under Layouts. This is very similar to maybe most IDEs that you use, like Visual Studio, and you can just go down to Default, and it'll reset everything. When it resets mine, for some reason, at least for this particular one, it puts it in 2D mode. And so if I try to pan around, or I try to use that eye to look around, it just pans it because this is in 2D mode, and we can use Unity to make 2D games as well. And it works almost exactly the same, except for you have one less axis of freedom to move around in. So if you want to do a side scroller, this is how you would do it. and it can actually be a 3D level, but the camera only moves in 2D space. So you're seeing a 3D kind of level here, and maybe I just have my character walk left and right. So it's a very powerful, even though it's 2D, you can still have 2D objects in there. So to change that, I'm just going to select the 2D, turn that off, and go back here. And you can see these little gizmos that we have define our lights. So we can set up lights, we can set up their intensity here. So I can change the color of this light to maybe white or black or dark, and then I'd rebake my scene. Now you don't always have to rebake the scene. You can have the lights be dynamic if you want, but when it casts shadows, it just helps to speed up the game a little bit, especially with a low poly game like this. If you're trying to do something a little bit more high-tech and more modern, then maybe you do calculate all that stuff real time. What you don't see in this particular level is a skybox. So if I looked up in the sky, normally you would see some clouds, or maybe it's nighttime. You don't see this because this is supposed to be in a dungeon, plus the camera's always pointed down. But we can set up a skybox. We can also set up a sun. In the sun we can animate, or we can control via a script, and depending upon where that sun is, we can also cast the shadows in various different angles. And so maybe you have a nighttime, or maybe you slowly over time animate that sun, and that can simulate sunrise, sunset as your player's going through the game. You know, make it every hour of daylight, hour of nighttime. So as the player's playing for 2 hours, he has one full cycle of game time. So all these elements that I've shown you are 100% scriptable. I can change the script to have the object move. I can have some function written so that when another object collides with it, it does something. Maybe it moves, maybe it has a force to it, that sort of thing. I can turn it on, I can turn it off. There's a lot of different things that we can script. Namely, pretty much every object that you see here in the inspector is scriptable. So this checkbox, I can enable or disable this object. So if I turn that off, maybe the lights turn off, for example. So you hit a light switch, you can say, okay, go through all these different objects and turn them off. You can maybe turn the color of the light a different color by getting the color attribute and then changing the RGB value of it. And so maybe if you're in a horror scene, the lights go from white to maybe red or something like that. So really, really powerful. We won't get into scripting today, but we'll show you a little bit of that later.
I have a question.
Yep.
Just in terms of, I imagine depending on the system, I don't know a whole lot about gaming myself, but the more components, the more data. How much do you want to have relative to playability? If I'm on an older Android system that's pretty slow.
So that's a good question. I will say that there is something called culling, which essentially means, let me go back to my third-person controller, and maybe, so let's say this is what the camera's seeing. I could actually go to that view and see exactly what the camera's seeing, but let me select that. Everything that's outside of what the camera is seeing is not rendered. Okay, so right now it's only rendering, I could get the polygon count of what it's rendering, but instead of maybe if I was a first-person view, or maybe the camera was angled like this, now you're seeing a whole lot more of the scene, which means there's more polygons being rendered. However, again, with the culling, you won't see anything behind these walls. And so the camera does some vector geometry. Essentially, you guys probably took vector geometry or something, right? No? Maybe? Okay, well, the vector geometry, you can get points, and basically you have a point emanating from the camera and say, does it hit this object? If it doesn't, because either it's behind the camera or it's behind another object, don't render that. And so it becomes very, very efficient as I move through this scene. Let's pretend, let's pretend I'm just flying through, I'm a first-person game here, you can see that maybe I'm not rendering everything behind me, but certainly in front of me. And so as I get maybe to this grand hall, that's a whole lot more polygons to render. So if I am on an Android device or other mobile platform, and you notice that as I'm playing the game on a real device, not on my computer, it slows down when I get to the scene. So maybe how can I help that? How can I make it better, more optimized? And there's a lot of different tricks that we have in game development. We can maybe add a fog, and so maybe you can't see this far, because that almost looks a little bit unrealistic, at least in a dungeon scene, to see that far. And so I can add a fog where you can't see past this this first railing here, or maybe I put up a big wall there, that sort of thing. But in this particular one, it's a third person. Camera's always looking down, and so honestly we won't see most of that. But let's see if my camera's going to work. Yeah, okay. Well, still a little bit of weird stuff going around on the top and the bottom on the side there. But yeah, so maybe as I get into this scene here where I can see farther, you notice that your mobile device, it's running fine on my computer, of course, but because this is a mobile class, we want to test it on actual hardware. And I will show you that in a few minutes here of how to actually get it onto a device. But I did want to show you, okay, this is probably a little overwhelming of, well, first of all, I'm not a modeler. Maybe I'm not a texture or Photoshop guy, so how do I do these textures? Lighting certainly escapes me as a skill. And so you might be thinking, yeah, how do I create all these assets? Well, the cool thing about Unity is they have an asset store. So you can get that by going to the Window menu, Asset Store, or hitting Command 9. And that opens up a new tab in your main viewer here. And hopefully this loads on this network. I think it froze up a second. Okay, well, you can also access that via store.unity3d.com, I think. Oh, Asset Store. What's the website? Assetstore.unity3d.com. So you can go in the Asset Store and buy these things. And so that's what I did for this dungeon scene. Is I downloaded it. For me, it was free at the time, but you can certainly pay for some of these. And not only that is, a lot of these are free. And they always have deals as well, so you can go on and you can see what you're searching for. So maybe you're looking for some 3D models. Let's just click on that to see what kind of 3D models we can get. We can get a city. So I don't know if you can see that in the back, but we got a little car here with a house, and it's called Low Poly Epic City. And so you can see just by the artwork that, let me click into this, you can see by the artwork that it doesn't have a lot of detail, it doesn't have a lot of geometry to this. So maybe this is good for your mobile game. In particular, this is $10, so not bad. You might want to investigate what it actually has. Maybe it has some scripts already written for you so you can drive this car around. If you're looking for those kinds of things, you can go to the Complete Projects menu here, and you can see there's a flight kit, there's a toy car game starter, there's some 2D ones, and you could just kind of search through these. As I said, some of them are free. Let's click on the flight kit. So maybe a client or yourself wants a game for like a flight simulator type of thing. I always love these videos because they always show off the gameplay of it. So maybe this is what you were thinking about doing for your game. And so why reinvent the wheel when you can just reuse somebody else's code base? And so maybe you use the accelerometer of your device to control that plane. And so maybe you just rewrite the control script, which is written in C# by the way, to handle that. You're getting the XYZ coordinate of your device's orientation and inputting that instead of the maybe ASDW keys to control this plane or however this works. And so, leverage these assets, especially because for this particular one, It's $30, which is pretty cheap for what you get. I mean, this is pretty cool. Obviously, you can, as I showed you, you can change these assets, you can change the colors, you can change everything very, very easily. They always have these sales going on, so 40% off, motion controller. This particular one, I don't even know what this is. Perfect AAA quality character controller for your humans and non-humans. So if you think the built-in Unity controller, first person, third person, are a little bit kind of not as up to what you're used to playing the most modern games, you can spend a little bit of money and get that to work perfectly. And they have YouTube videos you can do for that. So let's pretend. Let me go back to the Asset Store homepage. Did that ever load back up in Unity? Yeah. Okay. So I'm looking at this in Unity, and let's just find a free one. I already have all those. Let's just go. Let's see, I guess we're already on the home page. Let me go back to this because it's putting me in mobile view apparently. Let's find a 3D model that is free, and we can search on price. And let's say I want this space fighter. So if somebody made this, they posted it up on the store, we can download it. All I have to do is click in Open in Unity. It's going to ask me if I want to launch that application. It's already open, so just go back to Unity. It opens it up in my asset store. I can go ahead and download it. Luckily, this was a small file. And then here's all the assets that come with this spaceship. So we have the Fbx files. These are our meshes, and you can see what that looks like. I can barely see what that looks like, but there's something there. Here's another one. My engine trails, apparently a mesh. Here's, I don't even know what that is, the wings of it. But then most importantly, you have the materials that make up the object. And so we didn't talk about materials, but these are the things that cover your meshes, that give them color, give them basically a material, be it a metal, a plastic, a fabric. Those are the .mat files. So we get a bunch of those in there, and they're usually wrapped on a ball. The textures themselves are images, and you apply textures to materials, and then you do combinations of there to actually make the material. But you can see that this is kind of a, it's a strange cut up of the mesh. And so when you unwrap your mesh to make it flat, you can color on that texture to, put graphics on it, whatever. They also give you the, oftentimes they'll give you the Photoshop documents that they use to create these so that you can edit them yourself. And then they give you what's called a prefab that bundles up the texture into materials, the materials onto the meshes, and then you just have to drop the prefabs onto there. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's just click the import button. You can actively select some of these if you don't want particular ones, but I'm going to select them all. And where that's going to go is it's going to go in my assets folder down here in the lower left. And it usually creates its own folder. In this case, it's Space Fighter. I can move this folder anywhere I want to organize my directories a little bit better. But if you go into the prefabs folder, you can see that there's a low poly model and a, I guess, medium one. So if I drag the low, let's see. Let's go back to Ethan real quick. And apparently that did not import properly. It's weird. The one thing I grabbed, it didn't work. We can drag the meshes in themselves. And so these don't have materials on them, but if I go to the materials, I can drag in, I don't even know what this one is, but you can just drag it in here. Apparently that one doesn't work because these materials match up. Maybe that one matches a little bit better. You can barely see it, but let me turn on the lights in this game a little bit. Okay, I don't think that was the right one. There we go. So that by dragging on the materials, I can set the material for that model, and then of course it might. I guess it didn't have any scripts that come along with it, which is one reason it was free. It didn't, you don't expect too much from the free models, but if you wanted scripts to fly your spaceship around, then you might have to pay some. Though there are plenty of free assets on there that accomplish this stuff. And so you can see very easily. Now I have a spaceship in my dungeon. And of course, again, I can add scripting to this. Unity actually has some built-in aircraft simulations, scripts, and other things that are really cool. So as you maybe hit the left key, they have aileron controls. That the ailerons, they go up and down to fly the wing or push the wings up and down to steer it, things like that. So I highly encourage you to go to the asset store, download what's called the standard assets. So this is one of the ones I was talking about. With this standard asset, again, free, download. It's created by Unity. You get a car simulator, so change the model. Again, I showed you how to change that model, change the texture. Pretty easy to do with Photoshop. This jet plane in the background is what I was talking about. Has afterburners. Those afterburners are created with particles, particle generator, and they've altered the particle generator to look like fire coming out the back. And so if you're hitting the forward key to accelerate, the afterburners come on and those jets become larger. And so there's a lot of different things that we can download for free. Here's another one that is a bunch of models. And so if you guys ever put together model airplanes or model cars or anything like that, you might recognize this kind of layout where you have to twist the plastic pieces off of these connections in order to build your models. And so I thought that was hilarious, but that's the idea behind this. And yeah, you just import it into your library down here, drag it onto your scene. You can have multiple scenes. Scenes can be different levels, and so this is just one scene, but maybe you have another scene that's either harder or just advances the story. So you go around, create these. One thing that I did want to show you though before we wrap up, let me get rid of that, is for this particular one, what you want to do is look for assets that you can manipulate. So if I hit Control D, I can actually move this wall, and the lighting's going to be a little bit messed up, but you can see that, actually let me undo that because I think I selected the wrong. Okay, that's all right. So I'm going to duplicate that and move it out here, and then maybe delete this wall. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. That's fine. So maybe delete this wall, and then maybe build a floor, and then go ahead and duplicate this again. And you can see I'm building my level. Of course, if I walk through that wall now, I would fall off the level, but you get the idea. And so by reusing these assets like walls and everything like that, we can build whatever level we want to. And how do these walls work? Well, they are also models themselves. So if I click on this, it's wall 03, and let's see, wall 03. You can find the wall objects here. Go ahead and reveal that in Finder. So that's wall 01 in my wall and column under meshes. Go into Blender. I'm going to hit New, delete that cube, hit the import a Fbx file. I'm going to go to my development folder. Oops. Find my folder that is in, and that was called wall 01 in the wall and column. Okay, and so that's it. It's not anything too special. If I tab into it, you can see it's just made up of a bunch of triangles. So there's one triangle here and here, and the top kind of bricks here are individual items. And so I can select. Let's see. I guess they're not individual. they have a little kind of dividing line in here. But I can manipulate these all I want. I can drag these out, make them however you want, and then save them, re-export them, and I have my new wall. But you might notice that the wall doesn't look exactly like it does in Unity, and that's because of the material that it has on it. So if I open this up real quick, you can see that's what it looks like in Blender for sure. But this particular one has a, I guess it's, yeah, Medieval Dungeon Atlas 02. And so if we search for that, Medieval Dungeon something something something, it brings up a list. And so this is the texture, this is the actual kind of PNG file that we're looking at, and you can see that these bricks have highlights on them, everything like that. These are actually pretty easy to create in Blender if you want to do that. We won't go into this class, but if you take my game development class in summer, I'll go over actually how to create these assets, and most importantly, let's see, I guess, yeah, this guy. This is what we call a normal map. And so you can see this very similarly matches our texture that I just showed you. However, it's in very bluish red. And what the RGB values mean are vectors that come off of the surface. And so for instance, when we have these little cracks in the bridge or in the bricks, that as the brick kind of curves around, the vertices that come straight off of those faces kind of curve around as well. And so that's what these colors are signifying. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense to you right now, but what this allows us to do is give the appearance of extra geometry in our game. So if you look at our wall here, you can see that it looks like there are some cracks in here as I move the camera around. And indeed, we have this crack. I don't know if you can see that, but there is a little crack here, and that's because of the geometry. But when we get into the bricks themselves, that's not just the texture, because I showed you what the texture looks like. You can see that the texture here doesn't make those cracks very dark. I mean, it has a little bit of coloring on it. What makes those cracks dark is the lighting, and the lighting is being affected by what we call a normal map, and this is a normal map. And what normal means is not, ordinary or whatever. The normals are the vectors that come perpendicularly off of the faces of these objects. And so based on the color defines kind of where that normal comes off, and then thus gives us the appearance of geometry. So this is another way that we kind of fake having high poly models. We can kind of get this effect here. So yep, that's Unity in a nutshell. If you guys have any questions, I will take them now. But
how do you get? Let's say you develop a project.
Yep.
How do you get it up on?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I was gonna cover that. I missed I have a list here of everything, and that was the last one. So good question. So I've developed my game. Ethan's walking around this level. It's good to go. I want to publish this to the App Store. So go to File, Build Settings. And I think I showed this last class, but just to go over it again, we have all these different platforms that we can export out to. All of these are free. You can export to all these for free. There is one caveat though. If for all the platforms that you export out with the free version, you get a splash screen that comes up. So when your app loads up, it says powered by Unity. If you ever see a game like that, then you know the developer didn't pay for the license, which is fine because, as I said, it's free. But if you want to remove that splash screen and then get some other advanced settings in Unity, it's $1,500 for the PC, Mac, Linux, standalone, web player, all these other ones except for mobile, which is terrible because as a mobile developer, I have to buy a license for iOS. I also have to buy a license for Android. And if you were counting, I had to buy a license for the PC version in order to get the mobile version licenses as well. The mobile licenses are dependent upon that. So anyway, long story short, 3 licenses. They're $1,500 each. That's $4,500 that I had to pay for Unity. And so hopefully, if you're paying that much money, either somebody's paying you a lot of money to make games, or you're going to sell a lot of your $1 applications or $2 games in order to make that money back. Some people just look at it as a really expensive hobby. I know for some hobbies like scuba diving, you want to buy all the equipment, you're going to spend more than $4,500. So some people, again, look at this as a hobby. Luckily, I don't have to. But yeah, I get to do this for a living, so this is awesome. But to answer your question, I go ahead and switch platforms to Android. This is going to take probably a little while. Yeah, and the nice thing that they added in Unity in a couple versions ago is this X button, because normally you couldn't X out of that. So I'm going to stop that process, because what it has to do is it's going through all my textures and all my assets and everything that I have in my game, and it's converting them over to Android. But let's just pretend I did that. It's pretty much the same process for every platform. I just go ahead and do the build. Let's see, let's do it OS 10 because that's what I'm currently on. You can change the architecture. So for me, I might want to do x86-64, or if I'm trying to support maybe older x86 versions, I can do a universal, which will do both 64-bit and 32-bit. And we can do a development build, which is, there's some debugging and stuff in there. And I'm going to go ahead and do the build. I'm going to give it a place. I'm just going to go put it on my desktop. And that's going to take a second to build. But what that's actually going to do is create a Xcode project that when I build it, it's going to build for Mac OS 10. And so if I did that for Android, it would actually create a Android project for me that I can import into Android Studio. And likewise with iOS, it would also create an Xcode project, open up an Xcode, and create that IPA file, or in Android's case, it's an APK file. Create that APK file or iOS app, sign it, do whatever you need to do, and then upload it to the App Store, which we'll get to when you guys come back from break. These do take a little while to create all the assets, bundle these into files that Unity engine can parse and whatever. So this will take a while, but good question. Any other questions? You guys gonna go spring break and download this and start making games? Yeah, it's cool. I know a lot of people actually. I recently did an application, an iPad application, that was pretty much a fancy brochure, is probably the right word for it, where you can kind of flip through slides, basically. I had like a right and left thing, you could slide through them. I had a menu, and for whatever reason, the original developer for that made it in Unity. I guess they were a game developer, they were familiar with Unity. And so it's not just limited to games, you can do interfaces and then take that and export it out to all the different platforms that we have. So here's my game. So I opened it up, I called it BSU game, but you can choose the resolution, you can choose the graphics quality. Unity handles all that downsizing if you want to do that. And if I hit play, you can see that made with Unity. I can get rid of it because I do have the license for it. But now I'm playing my Mac game. And I could build this for Xbox 360, PlayStation 4. Though for a lot of those platforms you need a PC to... See, I didn't save my collider, so I could walk through a lot of these things. And again, I do have that backup bug that is persistent. And I can jump off the world. Whoa. And I don't have any way to quit, so I'm just going to get out of that. But yeah, so that's how you do Unity games. Very, very easy. It's all free. To get rid of that Unity splash screen, if you do want to pay the $1,500, is you go to Player Settings, and there's a little checkbox, and that's what I paid my $1,500 for, is to uncheck that checkbox, because on the free version, it's disabled. Not really. You get a lot more features with the Pro version, though. For what you guys are probably doing, and even what I've been doing, you probably don't need them. There's things like water shaders that are pretty cool, that allow you to do like really cool, like looking down into water and seeing fish and everything like that, and having the reflections and the ripples. You get that with the Pro version. There's things like that you get with the Pro version. Lighting effects, um, object culling. I think you only get in the Pro version. Analytics, optimizations, profiling. The list goes on. You can look at the website. Probably not worth your investment initially, but don't let me bad talk the Pro version because, yeah, I have 3 licenses on this thing. So anyway, if I actually... Well, that's all I got for class, so I'll let you guys go. But I'm going to build this one more time and play it again. See that there's no Unity splash screen.
If you're taking the extra credit for this quiz, I guarantee you there's a way to get people to come to class